This episode is presented by Nicovian. Welcome to Horse Person. I'm Caroline Culbertson. One of the questions that comes up again and again in equestrian sports is this: why isn't our sport more mainstream? Because if you step back and really look at it, it seems like it should be. Horses are incredible athletes. The partnership between a horse and a rider is extraordinary and really cool to watch. The stakes are high, the competition is intense, and the visuals alone, whether it's galloping across country or jumping massive show jumps or dancing through a Grand Prix dressage test, are objectively captivating. And yet, compared to so many other sports, equestrian sport still largely lives inside its own bubble. So what is holding it back? Is it the way we tell stories about our athletes? Is it the structure of the sport itself? And as our sport evolves, navigating conversations around horse welfare, social license, sponsorship, and even emerging technologies like AI, we have to ask ourselves, how do we grow the audience for equestrian sport without losing the culture and the values that make it special? And that's what we're digging into today. My guest today is Frankie Theriot, someone who has been at the front row of the evolution of equestrian sports for several years. Frankie is the founder of Athletux, which is a marketing, branding, and sponsorship agency that works with many of the top riders and brands in the equestrian industry. And she's also an upper-level event rider and a longtime broadcast commentator. She's somebody who has spent nearly 2 decades in front of the camera at major events like the Kentucky 3-day event. And over the years, Frankie has helped shape how our sport is presented to audiences, both inside and outside of the horse world. In this conversation, we are going to talk about what equestrian sport gets right and wrong when it comes to storytelling. We're going to talk about why vulnerability can be essential but also risky for athletes in our industry, and how riders can build brands that actually attract sponsors. And then we get into what it will take for equestrian sport to reach a broader audience. This is a thoughtful and honest conversation about the future of sport. Frankie really lays it all out there. She's very, very direct and very honest. This was such an enjoyable conversation to tape. I hope you enjoy it too. Let's get into it and hear from Frankie Theriot. Frankie, if you could snap your fingers and equestrian sports would become majorly mainstream, the way that soccer or American football are, do you think that our sport would be ready for that?
I mean, I think it's a great question, Caroline, because I think that the world is ready for it. And I think sometimes the limiting factor is actually us as a sport. I mean, I would argue that. I think that sometimes we're afraid to tell the hard stories that other sports aren't. And I think in order for more people to get more invested in the sport, you have to be unafraid to say the hard things and tell the stories that are so inspiring and interesting and hard, quite frankly. That was the first year Behind the Barn. One of the inspirations of it was to be able to tell stories like the real reason that Allison Springer, wore a helmet for the first time ever to change equestrian sports as an entire whole was because she had her only brother had a head injury that was life-ending. And we didn't talk about it for years. I was her PR person at the time, so I knew the reason. But we decided at that time to not make it about her and that story, and instead to make it because that was what she believed in. But it took a decade until we kind of uncovered and delve into that. And I think that our sport is unique in that a lot of times if people are vulnerable and show that vulnerability, then the governing bodies and decision makers view them a certain way. And I think it lends this reason for people to not want to be as vulnerable or tell about things that were really hard for them and be honest. And I think, I think that the world is ready for us to have it be a mainstream sport and for people to get on board. And I think really often about things like just watching the Winter Olympics and figure skating, right? And these athletes that have been amazing. And I watched the Netflix documentary, if you haven't, you have to, on some of the ice dancing athletes. And then it just really lends itself to you being invested in these people and wanting to see how they do. But their stories are hard sometimes, and they're full of truths and a bit of, risky situations sometimes. And I think as a sport, we have to be willing also to take the risk to tell the real stories, and to realize that that does put you in a vulnerable position, but also a position where people want to invest in what's going on.
What I'm hearing you say, and I want you to tell me if this is correct, is that the public, and probably even fans of the sport already, would reward athletes for humanizing themselves and telling those riskier, vulnerable stories. But maybe the structure of the sport and like the high performance side of the sport and what it takes to make a team wouldn't reward that. Does that feel right?
I think it's both. I think it feels like that is absolutely the case. And I think that a lot of the high performance athletes and people have become a little bit afraid to be vulnerable. And I think they should be, to be honest, because we aren't doing our sport any favors in equestrian sports in terms of, and I'll just throw it out there, like the keyboard trolls and the people who are these people at home saying really mean things. And I think that, anytime somebody is vulnerable, well, not anytime, but a lot of the time, they're beat down on for it. And so it doesn't really create a situation where you want to be honest about your story. And people want to hear these stories and these things and hear these vulnerabilities to get more invested in the sport. If you think about any mainstream sport, from golf to now, just my point of figure skating and Olympics. If these sports, or even F1, right? Think about how they've really delve into the stories of those athletes, and people have blown up watching the sport because of it. People that aren't really into race cars, right? The whole point is that you have some drama and some truth behind what's going on. But I think in our sport, it's a vulnerable place. And a lot of times the athletes don't feel like there's a backing from the other people in the sport. And it makes it so there's a lot to lose by being vulnerable.
That's a really excellent point. It reminds me of an interview that I did probably well over a decade ago with the Porter brothers in show jumping. And they were talking about how they wanted to showcase their personalities, and they were doing so in this interview. And they said that part of that was because they were really big golf fans, and they had observed and sort of studied how golf didn't really feel like a mainstream sport until the personalities like Tiger Woods were showcased for the world. And that really brought the sport to a mainstream stage. And I think oftentimes we have these conversations in equestrian sport where we think, well, why wouldn't people want to watch this? Horses are beautiful and horses are amazing, and they're galloping across country, and they're jumping really, really big jumps. And I'm wondering in this conversation, maybe that's not enough for the public to be, maybe that's enough for their interest to be piqued, but not enough to stay, because we're not playing up the personalities of the sport widely enough. Do you think that that's true?
I think it's so true. But I think in order to do that, because of the monetary backing being limited in a lot of the equine sports, and because people some of the time are getting by on a shoestring, you can't afford to lose backers by being controversial. And I also think that we have to, which is happening. I think that it is starting to happen, that we are ending up on ESPN, and we're ending up on a lot more mainstream broadcasts, and we're going the right direction. But for years, I remember when Josh Walker and I helped launch US Eventing TV, and I remember being in the boardroom with the board trying to sell this idea of US Eventing TV as a couple kids, and saying, if we don't cover our sport, who's going to? Yeah. And, making it about the venues and the experience and behind the scenes. And you can't just have the coverage, I think, anymore be about just the horse show. It's like, the coverage isn't just about the race or just about watch any golf program, it's not just about the golf, it's about the stories. And that's what hooks the viewers. And that's what gets people interested, especially with sports that they don't necessarily fully understand. And I think that if you asked any, I think it's so interesting because if you ask any equestrian and they have a specific, whether they're a venner or a dressage rider or a show jumper or, you know, a barrel racer, whatever your discipline may be, or vaulter, and you ask them about another equine sport, they don't know the ins and outs and intricacies of that sport. And it is confusing even to equestrian people. So I think you also, you know, what we're trying to do as commentators now that we've really started to focus on in the last couple of years is walking that line and balancing that balance between the equine viewers being able to understand. Obviously they do most of the time, but also I think that what we've had happen in our sport is we're really afraid to explain it on a more mainstream level because we think people understand. But then you're running into simultaneously that, you know, some of the eventers watching the dressage finals don't necessarily understand what's happening in the dressage finals, but you don't want to ask. So it's a little bit like we need to break it down more and we need to explain it more in layman terms that people can understand. And then I think we need to showcase these stories that sometimes are hard to talk about. But I think that the biggest thing that is going to have to change for it to really be accelerated more is for people to, quite frankly, just stop being so mean. I mean, the stuff I've seen in the last few years, and some of it, of course, is warranted, but some of it is just very shocking when you know really what's going on. Or, you know, I had one client who people were being horrific because they were using a fleece noseband. Like, people get on these tangents and they're saying like that's abusive. They're trying to cover up abuse because it was a fleece noseband. And I'm like, well, if you actually know what you're talking about, that's for the opposite reason. But these are the kinds of things, like, how do you have a conversation with somebody that is willing to say these things, but is so wrong? And I think, you know, of course, like, it's such a fine line because you want to highlight the things that are wrong and you don't want them to happen. But at the same time, like, I think the internet and social media has changed the world so significantly in that it is really risky if you want to be a top athlete in the sport to risk those things.
Yeah. And it seems like your reputation can change very, very quickly as the result of a lot of online banter and people having an opinion. And whether or not, you know, people should have an opinion, personally, I am, and I will say on this podcast, I do not agree with the idea that you have to have ridden at a certain level to have an opinion about something that you're seeing. I think that's not true. And I think
I agree with that.
Moved away from that
completely. And I think, you know, I didn't mean for that to come across that way, but I agree with you 100%.
No, I don't think that's what you were saying. I've heard that argument before.
No, I don't agree with that whatsoever. But I do think that what's happened is, like, I try to take each athlete I work with, for example, or each person I come across for face value, just as a rule in life, right? Like, not what people are saying about them, but how they've treated you and what you've seen. And I think that we're in a world now where it's so easy to hide behind things because you don't even have to say who you are, that you can say things, or maybe somebody did something a long time ago and they have tried to learn from that as a horse person. But now anytime they do anything positive, people just bring that up. It's like, how do you move forward from that? If somebody did that, I always like to think about like how it ties back into a different situation. And if somebody did that to you, like if you did something to someone in the 5th grade, and then anytime you tried to do anything in high school, they brought up the 5th grade, it would eat you alive. And you know, I think that people just forget that there's a lot on the line, and we want to grow our sport and we want to make it better and we want to make it positive. And people are really into, you know, making the technology better and making the sports better. And I think it has to come from everybody, to your point. Like, it has to be that everyone's thinking in this way. And
Yeah.
I think, you know, our high profile athletes, obviously, like they are in that position, just like in any sport, you're way more vulnerable. But I also think that we need to realize that sometimes, like, bringing up old stuff, or I mean, I could give you a million examples because of all the crisis communications I deal with.
Yeah.
And I try to be neutral in those situations, but also like know the ins and outs and look at them. You know, the noseband thing is a good example. Like if people hate a person, then they're willing to say anything, and sometimes there's no validity to it. And I think you should speak up when there is a valid point, and there shouldn't be, you know, abuse that goes unnoticed or anything like that. But I think too, you know, if you like, how do you argue with someone that's saying a fleece padding is to hide abuse when maybe it's to prevent skin rubs, like genuinely, you know?
Right.
And I think that people go down a tangent and they want to get on a bandwagon when we could all benefit from instead looking at each situation for what it is.
Your background, you're an upper level event rider. Your background mostly started in eventing, but you've branched out over the years, and you are very well associated with all of the Olympic disciplines and the athletes in them. Which discipline, if you had to choose one, do you think is best positioned to lead equestrian sports into the mainstream, and why?
I mean, I think show jumping is, because it's the easiest to understand, I think.
Okay.
I mean, it, you know, plain and simple in terms of English disciplines, right? I think the Western disciplines have done a better job of being more mainstream or having more people be able to understand them a little bit, because you can break them down easier some of the time, right? They're timed a lot of things, or, you know, I think the ones that are easier to watch mainstream are easier to understand. So I think show jumping can go into that category, right? Because if a rail falls, the layman person can see that fall. Whereas I think dressage, English wise, is the hardest, because it's very hard. Even if you're someone's spouse or a fan, it's hard to distinguish sometimes this being an 8 versus this being a 5. I think even if you understand it really well, it's hard, right? So
Yeah.
I think show jumping, and there's so much money on the line, and it's really kind of cut and dry. It's you're the fastest or you're not, and you hit the rails or you don't. You know, that's pretty easy to comprehend, I think. And then I think that there's a lot to play for on the line. And I think actually that show jumping has done the best job of being the most vulnerable. But I would argue that I think that a lot of the fans of the sport, or the way show jumping has evolved, has also given a bit more space for that vulnerability.
Say more on that. Why do you think that is?
I think a few things. I think financially, the sport as a whole has more financial backing, or comes with more financial means. And so when your comments or your vulnerability isn't necessarily linked to losing the potential to do what you're doing, you can be more vulnerable. But I also think that even things, when you break it down, it's really interesting, because I've seen a lot of riders cross between multiple disciplines. And I've had a lot of candid conversations with riders who maybe didn't understand a rider that came from show jumping into eventing until they went into pure show jumping, for example, like bits or things like that, right? They're like, they just didn't understand the crossover. And I think in show jumping, there's more of a spread of what's acceptable, not in the care of the horse. The care level is the same, but in maybe the equipment or the different things that are used and accepted, and the training techniques that are accepted. And I think because of that, there isn't as much judgment if something is different. And I think that's what a lot of these athletes are up against, that if you are doing something that's not at all unfavorable to horses, but maybe different, you're looked at really strangely or put down upon before people understand. And then a few years later, or a rider I knew that now is just in pure show jumping, they said to me, it's interesting, but when this other rider came to eventing, we didn't understand how they were. And actually, like, we had a lot to learn from them. And as opposed, we just kind of shut them out. And then now them being in pure show jumping, there's like, it's just different. There's a lot of things that are just different. And I think we all need to work harder to try to understand the different disciplines and what makes them unique, as opposed to just wanting to say, if it's not the same way I do it, it's wrong.
This episode is brought to you by Nakovian, a brand that I am so happy I stumbled upon during my quest to find flattering, top-quality breeches that last more than just a couple of weeks or months, and also hold up to lots of washing. Before I tell you more about them, I do want to mention here at the top, we have a discount code for you. Horseperson15 gets you 15% off your entire order at Nakovian.com. Okay, so I have found that equestrian apparel that checks all of the boxes is a tall order. There's lots of boxes to check, to be fair. We want it to be durable enough to handle farm life, flattering enough to feel confident in. We want it to perform like athletic wear, made of really good quality fabrics that hold up to sweat, movement, lots of washes. And here is the big one. It needs to fit. For real, not just a tiny handful of body types. I am an athletic girl with a lot of muscle mass. I have a big butt and big thighs, and thanks to, lots of squatting over the years, it has been challenging for me to find breeches that actually fit me. Nakovian fits me, it fits my tall friends, my slender friends, and my plus size friends. Their breeches and tops are made with performance fabrics that feel so good on your skin, like buttery soft. But the thing, too, that made me want to really highlight Nakovian here on the podcast is their size range. Because we've all had that moment standing in a tack shop pulling on breeches that were clearly made for somebody else's body. And Nakovian wants to change that. Their sizing is inclusive, it's thoughtful, and it's made for equestrians of all shapes because we all deserve to feel good and look good in our barn clothes, regardless of our size, which is frankly always changing anyway. If you are ready to upgrade your riding wardrobe to something that feels like it was actually made for you, check out Nakovian. You can head to Nakovian.com to browse the collection. That's Nikovian, and use the code HorsePerson15 for 15% off your order.
I want to talk a little bit now about your role as a broadcast commentator in the sport. You've been doing this for a really long time, and I have to imagine you've seen a bit of an evolution of the sport and what your responsibility as a commentator is in that amount of time. Do you approach the job that you have now differently today than you did maybe 10 years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, especially given how the sport has evolved and the increasing conversation around social license?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I think, listen, we're all like learning and evolving and growing. Caroline, we forget like how remarkable these athletes are. Like, how remarkable is it that you take a horse and you jump it over these big things, or you teach it to
it like doesn't make sense. It's amazing. Yeah.
Right? Like, it's incredible. We have an obligation as commentators and people in the sport to showcase the sport, but also to get to share with the public what makes it so remarkable. And so for me, I think the focus has really shifted in being able to, like I said earlier, break it down more for people to understand, and to not be afraid. I think in the beginning years, your audience was so strictly equine enthusiasts, which it still hugely is now, but we're trying really hard to bring more people in that aren't necessarily from that background. And I think because of that, you have to not be afraid to break it down a little bit more and explain what's going on and stop and think and, take a step back, like I said, and like really highlight how remarkable it is what these combinations do. And so I think the questions have shifted because of that. I think the way we explain it has shifted. And I think it's interesting being a former athlete at the top level and working with so many athletes and coming into the box now or doing sideline interviews now and really, you shut off all bias, like of who these people are and how you know them on the day to day. And instead you get to come into a different role of highlighting what's going on. And also, you're not there necessarily anymore, I don't feel like, to comment on, my gosh, that was horrible, or this or that, or really like this could have been better, but more to highlight what is happening in the moment. And I think we are, shifting more to being able to highlight it on more mainstream avenues. And because of that, we have to shift a bit in how we're presenting it. And I think in the current climate, it's more important than ever that we're highlighting it well. But the biggest shift I've seen is that I think years ago, you really had to kind of make sure everybody was operating properly PR wise and doing a good job and highlighting good horsemanship. And now I will say, like, I stand, at Kentucky for the last, getting really old, but 18 years, I've been fortunate to stand at the D box like for 18 years, which like, that's pretty crazy, right? This will be my 18th year. And I've never been on course. I've only ever stood in the D box on cross country, but I feel really fortunate to see those remarkable athletes come in and out of the start finish the whole day. And I think there used to be more, questionable horsemanship things. And I would like push people to tell them that now, like, it's pretty remarkable, like the different, how far our sports have come, all of them, and how people are really, really aware now of, how things are portrayed, but also like really putting the horses first in every single discipline.
So you would say that you're seeing a higher standard of horsemanship, horse care, horse management in those 18 years that you've been in the D box.
Every single way. Like, I think but I don't think before it came from intention. It was just the standard has changed. And I think that because it's important how our sports are portrayed, that's helped the standard change. And also we've just continued to get more knowledgeable across the board. And I think the coverage has changed in that, now I think we have learned the hard way some of the time. But I think that has created a situation where even as commentators, like, we never used to have conversations of, okay, what if this happens on course? Or what do we do in this circumstance? Or how do we address this? And we have those plans now, like A, B, C, D, and E, they're all there. And I
wanted to ask you, Frankie, like, when something controversial, I guess is maybe not the right word, but I think you know what I mean. When something shocking or something that could be portrayed as controversial happens on course, how do you balance honesty about the situation and also stewardship of the sport, knowing that non-horse people might be watching?
I think you have to be honest, and you have to also understand what I've seen over the years is that situations can actually look quite bad that end up being not, and vice versa. Like, you just don't know. It's one of those things where you can't necessarily pass judgment. Like, you see these things happen, you think, oh my gosh, and your brain goes all these places. And so for me, first, it's like being able in those moments to, you walk into the booth or you walk into the commentary with your emotions at the door, because there are a lot of people and that you love and that you deeply care about that you're watching. So I think it's putting on that hat first, but also being able to explain what's happening. But a lot of times I think that people listening think, oh, they're not being honest, like they know what's going on. But honestly, you don't always. Like, there have been situations where I think, like, okay, that horse is like, man, this is so bad. And then the horse is up and they're fine. They're literally fine. A few minutes later, they were just winded. Or the same with a rider. Like, I think, so being honest in those moments and saying, like, we will get you information when we know it. And I think what a lot of people don't realize about commentary and stuff is we are also at the mercy of, like, waiting for the information. It's not always that we know and we're not telling you. It's that We also are reading to know, or we've learned enough now to know that like sometimes the answers you don't know yet. So I think explaining what you can and getting the information as soon as we have it, like of how they are, and being honest and in that regard, but also of switching gears to highlight what's still going on, because usually the action's still continuing. So I think that's the balance.
This question might be a little bit out of left field, and I'm not even sure if you have an answer for this, so you don't have to if you don't. But I'm curious, we're talking so much about today in 2026, how things are different. And one of the things that is on the forefront of a lot of people's minds, maybe not in equestrian sport, but just in the world, is AI. Do you think about AI and like how it will impact our sport, how it will impact your job as a commentator, either from like a technical side in terms of your work and your role as a commentator, or just more widely in equestrian sport?
I think about it a lot, and I've had a lot of conversations with, especially, I have a young pro program at Athletux, and we work with professional riders in all different disciplines, like managing their sponsorships and social and all that. And to me, I think where AI is really terrifying in equestrian sports, and I'll just say it, to me, it's terrifying, is that people can make situations look like something that they really weren't. And I think that's scary. I think it's beneficial in getting the equestrian sports world caught up in some ways in terms of technology. But I think it's scary in the fact that people can portray you differently than is true. And it's really hard to differentiate what's real and what's not. So I think I think from a broadcast standpoint, I think it's hard to say, right? Because with live action and stuff, like I ultimately think I think AI is going to change everything like everyone else does. Yeah. But I'm not a tech person per se. I'll be the first to admit it. So, where I think it's helpful is in situations of editing things or stuff like that. But I think you still have to have good eyes on it. I do a lot of brand advising, and in terms of advertising and stuff, I think it can be really helpful, but also terrifying because you have to know what you're looking at. And I don't think AI yet is to a point where it knows like the front legs from the back legs or, certain things. I have a funny story. I was using AI the other day to do some research before a live stream. And I put in, tell me about so-and-so's young horse. And it said the horse is, and it told me it was their top horse. It was a nickname for the top horse, which I knew only a few things about this young horse, which was why I was doing the research. That was one of them, that it was not the top horse. And it said, and the horse is dead. I was like, okay, well, fortunately, I know that those two things are
that's not true.
I know nothing else other than this horse is definitely alive because it's entered in the show, and it's not the horse that's been all these other competitions. So, like, thank you, but this is totally not correct. So, I think that the part where it could get scary is if you have people that don't know the intricacies of the sport operating those things or like pulling that information, right? Because like, I know enough to know like those two things were definitely not true, but I think you have to weed through it in that regard.
You've mentioned to me off camera that some companies, even in the horse industry, are now no longer being run by horse people. What changes when that happens? Like, what impact do you think that has?
Well, I think people would be surprised to know that that's been happening for a very long time. Like some of our biggest companies, and actually I used to work in sports with the UFC years ago and other mainstream sports, and it's not a new idea, right? To have somebody who's really good at marketing be able to come in. I remember when I worked for the UFC, that happened, and she'd never been to a UFC fight, the new PR person, but the idea is if you're really good at marketing or PR, you could come in and do it in any sport, really. And we see that a lot with CEOs of different companies and brands, and we're seeing it in equestrian sports. But we have for a long time, like people who maybe come into decision-making roles that don't know the ins and outs, or what I see even more often is maybe they're really knowledgeable in the Western sports, but not in the English, or vice versa, right? So I think sports that are really, or I think brands that are really smart, maybe bring in somebody from outside marketing or, you know, whatever capacity. But then you have to have a consultant like myself or somebody who also knows where to spend. And I think we're seeing that happen in equestrian sports, or new brands coming in, like tractor companies or things like that are coming in. But if you look at sponsorship decks, for example, of different shows, like it all looks good on paper, but what is the best for your ROI? So I think that's where companies are really missing. And I think the scary thing about that is that you can get your brand into some trouble if you don't know. Like I ran into it recently with a company that is a really long established company, and they brought in a new marketing person, but the person didn't know who a multi-time Olympian was and the relationship that had been there for so many years. And they were just treating them equal as like all these other people in terms of what they were giving them or not giving them. And they lost the person. And I think that's where I see it really being a failure. But I also see it requiring people, again, going back to broadcasting, to not assume that everybody knows about your sport. You have to put like in your marketing deck or in things when you're talking to these people, like you have to give them what is eventing, what are the demographics, what is show jumping, what audience does that speak to? And I think if you include those things, just like in the commentary, and people don't know, they don't want to ask. But if it's included and they know, they just skip over it. They're not like, well, shame on you for giving us the demographics for dressage. Like,
yeah.
You know, so I think you have to not assume. And I think that's where I think it's really good to have people that aren't from the sport, because we're seeing it from a different standpoint. Like we're having some people brought in for producing and stuff from other sports. And I think it's good because it gives good perspective. But I think it then requires you to explain things in a way that actually will end up benefiting all of us, to be able to kind of step outside of what we're so immersed in.
Yeah. I'd like to take that down into just the individual rider level too, because I mean, Frankie, you've had eyes on so many individual riders over the years, and just are so immersed in the sport and how people are storytelling about their careers and how they're branding themselves. So in your work, part of your work is helping riders attract sponsorship. And that is something that people are going to hear on this podcast, and they're going to think, well, I'm also trying to attract sponsorship. So what can I learn here? What do you think riders are getting right and wrong about branding themselves and marketing themselves?
Well, I'm fortunate to work with a lot of brands, which is what I love doing too, in addition to the riders, of advising brands on who to work with. So I think I bring that unique perspective of seeing, like,
you really have an insider's look.
Really looking for, and what makes us pick between this rider or that rider. And, you know, with a lot of the young people I work with, to your question, you know, the more established ones and the younger ones, I think that people have to be like, what we want to see is authenticity. But in terms of attracting brands specifically, like, I think the biggest mistake people make is just trying to get another sticker for your horse trailer. I think you have to start with, what are the brands and products I use and love on a daily basis? Like, what are those? That it's not a stretch for me to say I love these, because I actually believe in them for real. And then I think going from there, you have to be authentic about who you are and why you use and love those products. Like, we're past now, just so many people are kind of equal. So what sets you apart? Like, and you have to get more creative in how you're pitching yourself to brands. Like, create a reel of a product you might want to use and tell them why you use and love it. Like, for real, like, what has it done for your horse? And why do you care about this saddle pad? And be genuine on that. I think now, you know, people were buying followers for a while, all these things. And now I think what we've seen in the recent market is really that you can read between that. It's just like with your question of AI, like, you can tell who's using that or who's being genuine.
Yeah.
in grant applications, in everything. And so I think my biggest suggestion to people that they're doing right is being authentic and deciding who you are and owning that a bit, right? Like, and I think one of the mistakes people make is they don't want to showcase who they are off of a horse. And I think brands care about that. Like, who are you in the barn, and who are you, how you portray yourself, and who are you as a person? And I think so.
Can I ask though, do you think that a rider can portray their political beliefs?
No.
Like, is that no? Okay. Okay.
I
I just want to hear why, because it's just
I'll
something
tell
that's
you
so
why.
at the forefront of everyone's minds right now.
Yeah, I think a few things. I think in terms of social media, like the way that I would view social media when I'm advising riders or young professionals or whoever it is, right? You have to think about your brand is a brand. Like, your social media platforms become a brand. It's just like, I've been doing a lot of work now through another company I have called For Real Social, and we're working with young athletes in all different sports, which is fascinating, about creating their social media and how to develop their brand buckets and all of the above. And one of the things we keep coming back to is you have to be unique, but you also have to think of this as a brand. And ultimately, the most important thing to remember, like, listen, I have a lot of opinions, Caroline, about a lot of things, but that is not, if you're trying to work with big companies and brands, you have to not be a liability first. Like, there are few people who are at the level where they can risk being a liability to companies and the headache that comes with it and still want to be chosen. Like, when I'm looking at riders through the brand's lens and advising them on who to work with, if people are controversial, if they're posting political views, all those things, like, the reality of it is that brands you don't want to be associated with, it's not because people are voicing their opinions. I actually think that's a good thing in life, right? To be bold and be honest. But it's that you could offend somebody who feels differently than you. And people don't always feel the same about things like politics, right? So it's more that I think that is not the platform to voice that, because you're there to represent yourself as an elite athlete and to represent the brands. And you don't know if somebody at the brand or somebody who's a fan of the brand feels differently than you. And it doesn't make how you feel wrong. It just makes it so that from a brand standpoint, it's risky to participate, because the person who feels different than you could be the one who's wrong, but they feel different than you. And I think that, to me, is the biggest thing, that you can't necessarily post how you feel while always making people who don't feel the same as you feel comfortable or also heard at the same time. And so I think you have to go about your posting or social, or, with these younger athletes I'm working with through my other company, like in all different sports, like admissions, or, now like social media has become your online resume. So you have to think of it that way. Yeah. And I think it's hard because it all ties together. Like, if we could all just say what we wanted and everyone could hear each other in a kind-hearted, like, understanding manner with open ears to receive the information and process it, it would be different, but not everybody's capable of that. So no, I don't think it's the appropriate platform. I also think you have to be really careful now, like, what you weigh in on and what you don't, because sometimes you're dealing with people who aren't open to truly hearing things from a neutral perspective.
If I brought you a 22 to 25-year-old rider and I said, Frankie, meet so-and-so, can you help them kind of get their career going, get their personal brand going? What would you tell them to start building today to future-proof their career?
So that's my favorite group of riders. So I'm glad you asked. Like, even from 18 up, I have this U25 program, and I restructured Athletux several years ago, and I didn't want to get rid of working with that group. So I created this under 25 program. Some of them are older, some of them are younger. They're in all different disciplines, but they're my favorite to work with, because I think There is so much to discuss there. I mean, I could go on a whole show just about that, but I think it's case by case. And I think the biggest mistake those young people make, or it's not even their fault, but they are so susceptible now with social media, especially to looking at what everybody else is doing and feeling just horrible about themselves. And I think so we start, for me, that group, like, what can they do? You have to be authentic to yourself, but you also have to figure out, and that age is really where you figure it out from a mental standpoint, where you are, where you sit on different things for yourself. Like, what does your warm-up look like to be successful? And I just had this conversation with a few of them last week. Like, what you do to get ready for some of the biggest shows, if you're an equestrian, is different person to person. It's not the same. And I think if you see good athletes and then you see the really great ones, and I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of people when they've gone from good to great. And I would argue that every single one of them finally figured out mentally what worked for them. For me, like when I was riding at the 5-star level in dressage, I put my headphones in and I did my final warm-up. And it was a heck of a thing to say to our US chef de keep at the time, like, hey, I'm going to have my headphones in before, so just give me a thumbs up, thumbs down. Like, but that was what I needed to win.
Yeah.
And when you're finally brave enough to figure out mentally what that is for you, I think you change. And so I've been pushing the young people I work with, like, figure out what that is earlier. Do you need to listen to the Calm app before? Do you need to lock yourself in the car? Do you need to watch? Do you need to take a nap? And I've been fortunate to interview so many athletes over the years. And I can tell you that is not the same for any two people.
Yeah.
But you have to be brave enough to own what it is for you. And doesn't matter if people think it's weird or whatever, like, it's what you need to operate successfully. And we see that in every other sport so much more. Like, they come to the field with the headphones on or with this or that. And I think you see it like at venues like Kentucky where people just have a few horses, but then they're afraid to like put that into action at lower shows and practice it. And I think that would be like number one for me. And then in terms of building their brands, like knowing, don't sell yourself short. Like, it's better, if you go back to branding and marketing, to have like a few really great sponsors that you align with from earlier on in your career, that have products you believe in, who believe in you. Like, you want to partner with companies who are going to see your value for the long term. And then I think that age demographic, like 22 to 25, they're like, oh my gosh, I got this great sponsor. I'm getting 20% off. I'm like, well, that's amazing. So you just save $5 on this saddle pad, and they're literally taking you to the cleaners of what they want. Like, it's a hard pass. So like for me, I'm like, I want to see every contract. I want to, and 99% of the time you go back and say, actually, like, I need this to be able to really be a great partner for you long term. And the brands say yes. It's just if everybody continues to sell themselves short, it never goes to another higher level. And I think though you have to be unafraid to turn stuff down and to have them be real partnerships. And also to, like, reading contracts, I always have that age group look through it. And like, if there are 5 things in there that there's no way in hell you're going to be able to do, then don't sign it. Say, hey, these things I actually can't commit to because I don't have a website yet. Like, call that out, because you want to be a great brand partner just as bad as like you want to be signed by them. And you want it to be a sustainable partnership. Because for me, like, I remember working with a lot of Olympians. Like, I have had riders fall off at the Olympic Games, and I could tell you, like, I could literally write down right now which brands cared in the moment that it went bad. Like, which brands sent flowers, which brands said, with a rider that had a catastrophic head injury, like, how do we help their team? Where do we send meals? Like, when it really matters, when nobody's looking, when they're not doing it for reasons, because there's a partnership there. And I think those are the people and the brands that you want to align with. And it's important to view those brand relationships when you're young for the long term, not just for this week. And if you sell yourself short, you're selling yourself short for what could be down the road.
Very, very good advice. Frankie, in closing here, I want to talk a little bit about growing our sport without losing ourselves, without losing what makes this close-knit world special. So as the sport pushes towards greater visibility, how do we grow responsibly, protecting horse welfare, protecting our riders from being maybe attacked by the world, and keeping the authenticity of who we are as a horse community while still expanding our audience?
I mean, I think that's a really hard question, but I think first of all, within horse sports, we have to try to support one another. It has to be the goal.
Mm-hmm.
And that I have found that when we try to have positive conversations instead of just be everybody's biggest critic, the sport benefits. We get better.
Mm-hmm.
We learn from each other. We become better horse people. And so I think that's the first thing. I would argue with anybody that I don't think the outside world is our critic for our sport. I think for so long we were so afraid of like, what does the outside world think? They're not critiquing it. The outside world as a whole, and you can chime in if you disagree, but I think they think what we do as equestrians is pretty remarkable. I think they think the horses are remarkable, and they don't see that tiny intricacies that everybody is so, quite frankly, hard on each other with when things don't go right. I think they're supportive. I think it's within our sports that we need to do a better job to say, like, how can I be better? How can we all be better? How can we continue to take the best care of our athletes we can and have and always do, and highlight the incredible things that are done for these horses, highlight the positive things, highlight what's working, like, you know, get ahead of injuries before they happen, all those little things, right? But highlight those positive things so the positive can continue to push out. Because I think if we continue to tear down everybody's little things, it only honestly hurts our sport. I don't think it's helping for the long term. I think instead, like, continuing to educate each other. And I think there's a lot of naive opinions. I think that's one of the things that we have to be aware of. Like, there's just a lot. And if we want to preserve our sport, and if we love these sports and want them to stay and want them to grow, we need to focus on educating people that maybe don't know those little intricacies and why things are done a certain way. And we all need to try to be better people at listening to one another about like why, and asking why without judgment, I think. Because I just think that the outside world like wants our sports and thinks they're really remarkable, but we're getting in our own way a little bit.
Frankie, it was a joy to talk to you. I could probably talk to you for an entire week. So thank you so much for being on and for sharing some of these insights. I know that people are going to find this to be very valuable. If people want to reach out to you directly, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, just info@Athletux, ATHLETUX.com. And I'm always happy to answer any questions about this stuff, or, you know, even why did a rider do this? Like, I'm happy to try to have conversations and provide insight. And I think branding wise and marketing wise, like, we're all in a unique opportunity where we can be better brand partners and highlight our brands. Or if you're a young pro and you need help, any of those things, like, I'm here and I love getting to be a part of these sports. So definitely. And I think, you know, the last thing, Caroline, is like, to further our sports, we need people to watch. So I think, you know, if you're watching an event and you want to help grow horse sports, or you're listening to this podcast and you want to help grow horse sports, like, just sharing these things, or sharing the live streams, or sharing any of that, no matter what discipline, that helps grow our sport. And that brings new viewers, and that brings new sponsors, and that keeps these sports alive.
Thank you so much for listening to Horse Person and giving me a little bit of your precious time and brain space. I hope you found something in this episode that fed your curiosity or gave you a new perspective or a new tool, or maybe just a little inspiration to keep going on the journey that you're on. If you want to support the show, please share it with your friends and family, share it on social media, and leaving a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify is extremely helpful to helping this show grow. And also showing our sponsors some love as well and telling them that you heard them on Horse Person. That is so helpful and will help this show grow and expand and serve you better over time. And finally, if you have a topic that you want to hear, send me an email. My email is caroline@horsepersonpodcast.com. See you next time.